Good evening, everyone. System Chalk here with the 192nd episode of Book of Hours, our first YouTube run through the House of Light expansion, playing as the archaeologist. I've zoomed in on here just because I recorded an introduction, or I recorded a new episode at the start, but I think it was 3 minutes in, talking about the history of the game, and I like talking about that, but I know that doesn't quite work for everybody, so I'm trying to be a little more prompt this time around. I will just say a couple things. First of all, I've got a big to-do list on here. So solutions and separations to 6, herbs and infusions to 6, orchids and narcotics to 7, watchman's paradoxes to 6, strings and songs to 6, and restore the occult scrap. All of that's going to take the consider verb. And then I did want to just leave a comment here. I think this is where I got probably diverted a little bit, but I was delighted to see a comment, which I haven't actually replied to yet, saying how they appreciated seeing all of the conclusions through the commitment to the Tree of Wisdoms in one place. I'm definitely interested, so I'll do that for the rest of the branches once I correct the mistake that I made, but I also intend to do that for the full Tree of Wisdoms at some point. That's going to be a more reading-heavy episode, but I think it's going to be one that people appreciate. So thank you for that. That is really useful feedback because I wasn't 100% sure if that was something that people would appreciate. Now, let's see, what's my best option for moving forward? All right, so it does look like, oh, we have one book on the way. I'm going to guess I probably made a specific choice in terms of how this would turn out, but let's see. Okay, here's the first thing I'm going to do. I should take the time, so solutions and separations seems to me that I'm going to use preliminal meter for that. Now, herbs and infusions is going to need either heart or nectar, so Sacra Solis Invicti won't help. Neither will Tredes Mahaira, so that's surgeries and exsanguinations. The Watchman's Paradox is lantern or sky, so that's a pretty straightforward one for Sacra Solis Invicti. Sorry, I wrote the wrong note for surgeries and exsanguinations. And then Strings and Songs also has Sky, so it's pretty clear to see that that's Sacra Solis. And finally, Orchids and Narcotics, either through process of elimination or the fact that Tredes Mahaira has Grail. That's the last one on the list. So, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so where's number 6? More Sorrowful End of Lady Nona. I wish I remembered what this was for. I'm going to run with it. Now, I feel like I've kind of put myself into a little bit of a corner here. We've got half a day to go, but if I haven't been reading all of these books, it does sort of make me wonder how I'm going to push some of this stuff over the edge. So what I'm going to do for this approach here, I'm going to take the time to, I think I'm actually going to work out the full path for herbs and infusions, unless I'm working on that right now. I am. Okay, so I need 5 heart or nectar. Alright, I have a guess here that the most sorrowful end of Lady Nona is probably an impulse text. That would explain the gap here. So that's probably why I haven't done too much uh, with the herbs and infusions, but let's see if we can make a little more progress. So impulse, solace, storm, satisfaction, just double checking here. Oh yes, cheerful ditty. Which technically on its own, that combination that I mentioned there would be sufficient to bring us up the level, but then that also invites the challenge of there's the challenge of getting the impulse. Now the Great Counterfeit might help me with that. I mean, I guess I can use the lantern. The one that I really need something for would be the orchids and narcotics. I could also use the rain. Okay, so here's what I think I'm going to do. If we're getting an impulse for the preliminal meter... Actually, you know what? I don't need to make this that complicated. We are going to use the pale desk. I am going to just simply get another impulse. Then we go for solace. So here we're just going to aggressively go for herbs and infusions. Slightly nervous about the gap that I see here. But you know what? Let's go for it. I'm also trying to remember where I was on these, but... storm next. I want to be careful with my Faust because I'm going to need to use that for other things. Satisfaction, which technically we're going to be competing with for orchids and narcotics, but I've got the Great Counterfeit and the rain set aside for those as well. I don't even remember where we were on these, so let's do Callus, or you know, I think we did Callicite, so Journey to the Grove. And then we already have the Cheerful Ditty, so that in theory should cover me for the herbs and infusions. Moving to the next, I could try orchids and narcotics, but I feel like that will... I think that just puts me on a collision course for the... Oh yeah, no, I see the problem now. I feel like that just puts me on a collision course for the herbs and infusions. Now, the problem with Watchman's Paradoxes and Strings and Songs is that both of them are really appealing for sky options. In fact, Strings and Songs also has the drawback of competing with herbs and infusions. So for these last few desks, let's go for the lantern we can get. We've already got the foresight, so I imagine we're not going to have that much on the table. But I can at least go for a confounding parable. And then we don't seem to have a revelation, so I can at least work with that. And actually, now that I think of it, Bittersweet Certainty. All right, so not the tidiest approach that I've had towards leveling things up, but I think we should be okay. The skill is now level 5, its power aspects have also increased. Now, I'm just going to make sure that I didn't set myself up for some sort of disappointment with solutions and separations. Yeah, okay, that's why I wanted to check, because obviously I said, well, you know, I'm clearly waiting for the impulse. Now, the drawback here is I imagine I can't avoid duplicating the impulse anymore. I think I ran ahead a little too quickly, but in the grand scheme of things, that's just one memory that I've let an inefficiency creep in for. So we will run ahead. At last, I'm something of an authority in this. I think I'll just let I'll let Ava's desk cool down while we deal with the rest of the books. Unless I consider the I don't think I can consider the paper, actually. The Most Sorrowful End of the Lady Nona, an unauthorized account of the death of Abbess Nona, written by Eusebia, one of the two sisters accused of having murdered Nona through the poisoning and arts unsanctioned. Eusebia, awaiting execution, intends to hide this account in her cell. Nona has introduced Eusebia to an unsanctioned Thunderskin cult, which meets in the caves below the abbey. There she and others perform sacred dances for the preservation of the kingdom. Eusebia claims that Nona asked her and another sister to prepare her a lethe draught, which can be brewed from another beverage with herbs and infusions techniques and a sufficient quantity of nectar. For a rite, all three of them would perform below the abbey. Something goes awry. Nona is possessed of a tenebrous spirit, and the alley brethren are forced to quell her with star iron. The other two are implicated as scapegoats, Eusebia implies, though she acknowledges her fault also. So there's the impulse that we needed. Again, this will probably get overwritten, unless I really want to push ahead, and I could probably make this work with herbs and infusions if I took these, the Rain, the Great Counterfeit, and the Hive's Lament, but I feel like that's moving too much to try and avoid a fairly simple overwrite. All right. As I used to say in my youth, the day is done and so am I, but I've earned my pay. In summer, I am sitting on the bench outside the Sweet Bones, eating crumbly cheese and nettle wrappings and good black rye bread, soaking up the sun. Okay, on Thursley's Ivories and Lovelies, Fiona Ayrshire recounts her visits in dreams to the Red Church in the Mansis and her conversations with the names of the Grail. An hour, Ayrshire explains, may usually only have 7 names, but since the Thursley's Ivories and Lovelies, who usually comprise the Red Grail's names, are constantly attempting to devour one another and the names of other hours, the number fluctuates. Lovelies, the freshest of the Grail's names, usually adopt the characteristics of whatever they devour, be it an Ivory, a Thursley, or occasionally an entirely different kind of name. A practical application of the principle is described. The arts of resurgences and emergences, in the presence of sufficiently potent Grail aspect, can be used to feed a pale Mommet to its successor doll, creating something notably more avid. So, more impulse. The Mirror of Melisande, the daybook and dream journal of Abbess Melisande, venerated as a saint and respected as an alchemist. Melisande speaks longingly of those we would call from behind the sky. Melisande claims that the sights and sensations arts that she describes can be used to invoke the dream of a star when sufficient sky aspect is invoked to uplift an ascendant harmony. So again, all of this is heading towards the herbs and infusions. A Journey to the Grove. Black Ellie, who much later became Damascene matriarch of the Sisterhood of the Knot, recounts her journey to the Grove of Green Immortals. In the Grove, Ellie meets with an entity identified as Three Faces, Nine Colors, who may have become her lover. Three Faces is the name of the Applebright, the nowhere hour of youth, healing, and mutation. It offers Ellie a form of eternal youth to take back west with her, which she rejects for certain reasons. She does promise, however, to renew their acquaintance in the season when the Applebright is the witch, not from sentiment, but rather grandly to ensure the continuity of the histories. The Origins of Hours. The sage and ecstatic Soham, frequent visitor to the Mansus, claimed to have discoursed with the beach crow in person. Soham later insisted on a sky burial. Soham's writings veer from poetry to confession. He identifies from flesh, those who were mortal, from blood, those who arose from sacrifice, from light, entry from the glory, and from stone, those who arose before his knowledge. He insists that the moth was the first god who was blood, but later contradicts himself and claims it was the Red Grail. The Mansus was different before the first god came from light, but never doubted existed, even then. This would be for some of the sky stuff. What does not bark? Alexander Probst writes warily of Calyptra, a law, principle, or society which prevents the dissemination of dangerous knowledge. Calyptra, like the planet that occludes the star, or the Doylean dog that fails to bark, can be identified only by its absence. Even the name, I think, must be a mask. Calyptra is said to make exceptions specifically for the libraries of the Watchman's Tree. Does it make those exceptions so the Hours can make use of them? Sunrise Awakenings, an uncharacteristically poignant meditation by the edgelong Trog of Marianid, who later came to Hush House under a variety of other names, often in search of some sort of fight. If light were not silent, it would be music. If music were visible, it would be light. Each day's light, Trog suggests, is faintly touched by the light of every past day, so in the light of every present day we may begin to understand something of days to come. At least this appears to be his conclusion, but he stops in mid-sentence, apparently having lost patience with the act of writing or possibly been ambushed. And Musgrave's grave sketches. Musgrave, 4th Baron Brankrug, was widely mocked as the Bleating Baron and the Lambda Wolf, but these sketches reveal a complex, somber inner life. Art begins in colors, grows dappled, finally is either mostly darkness or mostly light. Musgrave discusses the temptation of the perfectly minimal palest painting. He has so far managed to resist this temptation, but does guiltily describe success in using sights and sensations with winter aspect to create first a chilly elixir from flowers, which he believes he can refine further into a final pigment. I think we are one short for the leveling I want to do, but we do have some reserves. So we've got herbs and infusions, we can add the cheerful ditty, the impulse, the solace, the satisfaction, and the storm. This is why I don't rely on my intuition for this stuff. Let's do core. I guess it doesn't really matter in this case, but at last I'm something of an authority in this. Improve the skill to level 6. Now, we've got 30 seconds. It's not going to be enough to get a whole new book, but we can at least take stock of where we are. So I believe for both Watchman's Paradoxes and Strings and Songs, they are at level 5. Yes. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is not going to cut it. Technically, with Watchman's Paradoxes, that's Lantern and Sky, so I could actually employ the Great Counterfeit towards it, and I'm slightly inclined to do so because it's not that hard for me to read and get the Great Counterfeit again. I also know that there was some interest in the Great Counterfeit from that comment, so probably wouldn't hurt for me to be able to read and comment on it myself. The other alternative, or at least the other thing I might want to pursue in terms of reading, would be to think about... Sorry, I gotta sneeze. Think about how I'm going to get to Orchids and Narcotics 7. Let's actually take some time to write that out. So impulse. Let's take it from the top. So Cheerful Ditties doesn't help in this case because it doesn't have Nectar or Grail. Got Foresight doesn't help. We've already got Impulses written down. Confounding Parables doesn't help because it doesn't have Grail or Nectar. Same with Storms, Patterns, Regrets, but Satisfaction definitely helps. Already getting an idea of how hard this is going to be. Nothing for Hindsight. Fears doesn't help. Contradictions, Edge and Moon. Salt doesn't help us. Also, I apparently can't click on it. Yeah, Solace, Revelations, but Gossip does. No, we already have Beguiling Melodies, but I should add that to the list. And then Bittersweet Certainty, Stolen Secrets, Intuitions, all of those are coming up short. So I've got Rain, and then the Newman. Not a lot to work with. But again, that's fine because I'm fine getting the Great Counterfeit again. So let's actually get prepared for that, because I imagine that's going to be quite a bit of work on our part to get everything queued up again. Shurdik Book of Suns. Beguiling Melody is already there, so Gossip, Satisfaction, and Impulse. When I want to start being a little thoughtful just because I'm coming up short on a few of these, but we should have enough for what I want to do. Okay, so that covers me for Orchids and Narcotics, acknowledging the, acknowledging the special inputs that I need. Actually, sorry, let's put Great Counterfeit back up here because we're generating a new one. So Solutions and Separations is taken care of. Herbs and Infusions is good. We're on our way with Orchids and Narcotics. We should be leveling up Watchman's Paradox next. So the last is Strings and Songs. This one's a little bit easier for me to work with. So it is admittedly Heart and Sky, but it's Heart and Sky in a context where I have effectively every form of music except Beguiling Melodies available to me. So we can start with that. In fact, maybe what I will do, I think I will listen to Opening the Sky just for... starting to give up a little bit of Shaft, but just so that I can keep the desk open. And then from there we can go to Ambrose's desk and listen to Unhatched, or read Unhatched Hymns. Okay, so that's 2 for Strings and Songs. Founding Parable's another option, although we don't have the Vax. Well, okay, so, but that doesn't mean I have other options other than the phonographs. Okay, 3. I believe I just need 5, right? Yeah. So Solace brings me home. And then I guess we use the remaining time, if I can, to get the occult scrap back, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that. So I don't know. I think we did a reasonable enough job getting through that. I suppose one question I will have is whether I want to try for another skill. If I do, I kind of want to make sure that it's something nice and self-contained for the end of the season. What I might do here is once I finish the levels that I currently am working on, maybe I'll see how that relates to my plan to place things in the Tree of Wisdoms, and if I don't think I can reliably level that stuff up, maybe what I will start doing is leveling up some elements of the soul. Okay. Watchman's Paradoxes. That one we don't have any well, okay, sorry. I keep saying we don't have options, but I do in fact have Faust because you only need the lantern or the sky. It just seems natural to just use Faust for Watchman's Paradoxes, though. The other thing that's nice about this is locking that in, we sort of know we're on the back half of reading the book, so in this case here it should just be a straight path for reading the various books. Or sorry, it should be a straight path for committing things with the consideration, and reading books is just, you know, doing whatever bit of extra I want at the end of the day. The Shuritic Book of Suns, a radically different text from any of the other versions of the Book of Suns attributed to Hagar, Queen of Shur, Mother of Wolves. Set down with reverence before the intercalate by one who understood what would come to pass. Apocryphal chapters foretell the means by which the Sun in Splendor and the Forge might circumvent the impossibility of their joining through proxies that are in some sense themselves. The Sun in Splendor and the Forge of Days could not be joined, but Sunset Celia and the Swan King could. This secret is the trick of it. So I don't, I've kind of commented before. I realize we're sort of short on time, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I did want to acknowledge that comment before, and maybe I'll try and expand on it when I give a text reply. But this may not be a bad little example in terms of how I approach you know, something that is not immediately obvious to me, and sort of how I sort of poke at the edges to sort of see what these things mean. Now, I suspect I'm not going to be giving anyone anything that they don't already have from a straightforward reading, but sometimes it's nice to just go over the basics, go over, you know, when I run into something in a game, here's how I sort of put a box around the problem, and the rest sort of becomes more detail, more implementation of the solution, rather than sort of trying to find out where to go. So we've got Sunset Celia and the Swan King. Now, it could be that there is a... this could be the first time... This is one of the things that I think is really interesting about Book of Hours, but it's also one way in which it becomes a little challenging for people to try and have a... like try and come to some sort of final truth in terms of the setting for the game. It's not to suggest that there aren't answers to some of these things. I think some of them will support multiple interpretations or readings or whatever, but there are definitely some cases where you can say something isn't X, right? And I definitely think you can point to some things where the game has quite obviously created a number of conditions under which you would be, you couldn't be blamed for thinking X, but it does turn out it's Y. I noticed that's a trick that Weather Factory uses a lot, and it's quite satisfying when you discover it. So a really good example would be on the live stream. I definitely have had a couple of people coming in very confident in terms of saying they know what the crime of the sky is, and it's always wrong. And I actually partly know that it's wrong because it's the first impression I had when I read about it in Cultist Simulator. But it's usually not the first thing that people think of. And then as you play Book of Hours, you'll definitely find out what it is. But anyway, so set down with reverence before the intercalate by one who understand what would come to pass. I do think mention of the intercalate is relevant here. Apocryphal chapters foretell the means by which the Sun in Splendor and the Forge might circumvent the impossibility of their joining through proxies that are in some sense themselves. So if you don't know the relevance of specifically the Forge of Days and the Sun in Splendor, I suspect most people will understand that the Sun in Splendor is something of an important component to the intercalate. But if you're not familiar with the role that the Forge of Days has to have in the intercalate, I would say that's relevant here. When you see a reference to the Sun in Splendor and the Forge, usually the first thing that you're going to think of is the intercalate, although not the only. Now you do also have the idea of the impossibility of their joining. So one way I kind of like to think of some of the points of story or implication inside of these documents is I always kind of like to think of them as sort of these hooks that are dangling in front of me. And it's sort of my choice. I mean, it kind of, I guess in the context of fishing, it doesn't lead anywhere good. And I suppose that's true for the secret histories as well. Sometimes it's better to just leave books unread. But insofar as you've committed to exploring the occult world, you get to sort of pick which of these hooks seems interesting, which of these are promising. Where do you start pulling and get a result? So one of those hooks would be the impossibility of their joining, right? So what is it that specifically keeps them? Are we talking about an actual barrier between the two? Are we talking about a law that's preventing it? There are a number of ways that you can go on that, but that would be something to explore. And particularly because it's talking about circumventing it through proxies that are in some sense themselves. And of course, the fact that this is called the Great Counterfeit, and you get the payoff in the Newman, the Sun in Splendor and the Forge of Days could not be joined, but Sunset Celia and the Swan King could. This secret is the trick of it, right? And so, of course, we have the counterfeit Sun in Splendor, counterfeit Forge of Days in the form of Sunset Celia and the Swan King. Here, they're trying to circumvent the impossibility of their joining. So again, understanding the restriction against their joining, understanding why the Sun in Splendor and the Forge of Days might want to be joined. And then also, it might be helpful. I believe when I had read The Great Counterfeit for the first time, I didn't necessarily associate Sunset Celia or the Swan King with the Sun in Splendor or the Forge of Days. So in that sense, too. I mean, obviously, I definitely know that there had been some references to swans before. So maybe there was something... Maybe there was something there, but I think I was thinking of it more in terms of some of the historical myth. But in any case, this is one of the things that I think is kind of helpful about this, is that when you just think, if we were to break this down entirely to the 4 different items that we get related to this book, and sort of things that you could imagine if you could go and look at every single document related to this game, what are some of the terms you would search for? If we ignore that, so I mean, maybe the authorship has something on here. So Hagar, Queen of Shur, Mother of Wolves. If we ignore this part altogether, we'd want to look up the intercalate. We would want to look up Sun and Splendor. We'd want to look up Forge. I guess we don't have an individual search term, but we would definitely want the restrictions against their joining. And then we would look for Sun and Splendor, Forge of Days. I think we already covered that. Sunset Celia, Swan King. And then from there, investigating each of those, you are going to want to, that's the first set. Every single one of those concepts are going to lead to their own sort of sub-searches, right? So once you've sort of found out about the prevention, why the Forge of Days and the Sun and Splendor couldn't be joined, then you're going to want to say, okay, so what are the implications of that? And of course, that's going to lead to its own sort of set of searches. And I'm obviously, in some cases, especially with the secret histories, I think what you will tend to find is that it's very good at creating impressions. And so what I'm describing is a very ordered way of thinking. And I've actually, from no less than one of the developers on this, on one of the Steam broadcasts, they did actually point out my very ordered and structured way of thinking about the game. And then they know I have a background in economics. So I think, I don't know if that was directly invoked, but definitely, I'm sure at the very least there was, that was sort of accepted as a potential factor. And I do need to confess that in terms of talking about this sort of thing, it's a lot easier for me to try and describe a system, right? To try and impose some order on research, let's say. But the truth of the matter is that this game is very good about creating the right impressions in your mind. Sometimes you will just investigate something or you'll make a choice. And I've done this on live broadcasts where I can't necessarily articulate why I go for a certain book or make a certain decision. I just do it, and it very often turns out to be right. So this is the thing, right? In the end, I'm always going to have to acknowledge that there is a role in terms of that intuition. The only reason I don't describe it as much is that I'm not entirely sure how I follow my own intuitions is something that can be generalized to how other people will work with it, right? I think I know its value. I've directly benefited from its value, but it would be hard for me to sort of say, it's like sitting down and saying, okay, here's 10 steps for having ideas that nobody else has. Like if there was a system for it, everybody would be applying it, and all of a sudden they're no longer original ideas. But at least in terms of I sort of think is like not a bad little autopilot to work with, so that if you feel stuck, you want to, this is a game, right? So the joy of it is, you feel like going down a particular rabbit hole, you pursue it, and you take it to either a logical ending or the limits of where you've been able to figure things out or where it stops being fun, whatever path you wind up taking. But, at least insofar as you sort of say, okay, I want to spend some time maybe understanding this world a little bit better. How far can I go? What's a useful default to maybe push out the frontier of what I can understand in this game? I think being able to get that idea of sort of those hooks dangling in front of you. And the one thing that I like about that is that there's no pressure, right? So the only pressure you're really putting on yourself is just your own feeling of accomplishment or enjoyment through understanding things. So if any of those hooks doesn't sound very interesting to you, then, you just walk by, and then, you just pull on the one. And that's, those are for those times when you're sort of feeling a bit drained or not inspired, or just the ideas are not coming for you. Falling back on something like that is a really nice way that you can sort of make some progress towards a target without that necessarily having to become your primary driver. So insofar as I don't know if anybody has ever said, oh, I wish I was better at the lore. So first of all, like, there is no such thing as good at lore, right? If you enjoy it, if you pursue it, I kind of feel like you've done it correctly. Obviously there's people who will speak very confidently on certain topics, and there are wikis for things, but I'm not entirely sure, like, I'm not entirely sure the enjoyment of Warhammer 40k is the mastery of the topics that form these 10 or 100,000 long entries. Like, sometimes you just want to paint your miniatures, or you want to move them on the table. But as far as sort of gaining a bit of an understanding, maybe being given an interesting question and then sort of pursuing that as far as you can for yourself, and maybe feeling like you can participate in the conversation from your own impressions, I think those can be really enjoyable. And that, that's the sort of thing that comes through engaging with it on your own terms. And I'm sure there's always going to be somebody who will want to turn around and tell people they're right or wrong on something. But I think in the end, taking that time to engage with it yourself, and where obviously the right or wrong can sometimes be some useful guidance, so I don't want to completely disparage it, but insofar as it becomes useful for directing someone to a more satisfying answer, or pointing out, oh, that's a really interesting idea, but did you ever consider X, those I kind of feel wind up being a little more constructive towards something where you reach a point in the game where you feel even more satisfied by those endings that you get, or whatever you're pursuing inside of these. Anyways, this was like a 10-minute rant. I hope that was useful for some of you, but we will be back on Wednesday for some more of the book reading. See you then. Take care.